Awesome. Welcome, everyone. As we get people joined, we'll have people joining from across the country here, which is amazing. So, grab your lunch or grab a coffee in the afternoon, and we've got some great things to share with you today. Just a couple housekeeping items as you join in. Don't worry, I'll have some slides up on video if you want to view them. Those are kind of just going to be directions for talking points. At the end of the webinar, we're going to send everything back out to you so you can view the slides. We'll have some resources to share, and you can listen to us if you want. Depending on what you're doing, you can change the view. So whether you're on mobile or whether you're actually on your computer, you can change it. So whether you want to see more of us or you want to see less of us, just feel free to play around with the view. Personally, the less I can see of myself, the better. So if that's the same with you, that's great. Just a bit of housekeeping. Remember, this is not legal advice. None of us are legal professionals. What we're going to be sharing today is opinions, things from our experience, thought processes. So if you're looking for some legal advice or additional professional help, please go through and do that. We'll also be talking about resources where we can dive deeper in with Chris and Eli afterwards. So if you want to go deep on specific topics that we cover, we'll provide some specific content for that as well. We've got a pretty fun schedule today. This one is going to be fairly broad as far as we're going to walk you through a bunch of traps and things that especially Eli and Chris have seen in their 30 plus years of real estate experience. And they've got exceptional backgrounds. If you haven't experienced them before, their website's got a ton of content. It's all around community and sharing experiences with the two of them. So I'm really excited to kind of pick their brains and go through and talk around their experience as well as some of mine that we can hopefully help you prevent from getting into a trap in real estate, because we don't want to get into those because they can last a little bit, especially depending on what state you're in. You can really get into a bit of a challenge. So the other thing as well is we like to keep these pretty dynamic. So if you do have questions, you'll notice there's a Q&A button there. The chat, feel free to use it. You can message each other and kind of collaborate in that aspect. But if there's something specific you want to make sure that we try and answer here, drop it in the Q&A. I'll try and get to those towards the end or as we're going through. And if we don't end up getting to it, don't worry, we'll try and follow up with you afterwards as far as getting the answer. And then at the end, we'll share a couple of resources that we're going to be talking about. So if you want to take notes, great, but know that we'll get into things at the end. So quick little intro, you'll get to know us a little bit, but we've got Chris. Lots of experience. He's one of the co-founders of the Landlord Guru. He's got everything from short-term rentals, multifamily. He's been in this game for a long time and focuses a lot, along with Eli, around now sharing that knowledge beyond just managing their portfolios, but also trying to provide resources, coaching sessions, one-on-one things with the groups. Eli, same thing, co-founder with Landlord Gurus, but has a bit more of a construction background as well. So you might hear him talk a bit on renovations. We were actually just talking before this around things with units. So both of these gentlemen have a huge amount of experience in the real estate sector, lots of different types of real estate deals. So amazing resources to have. Myself, I come from a real estate background as far as 15 years of investing in different types across Canada and the US. I've spent the past 6 years part of the founding team with FrontLobby, so spend most of my days trying to help housing providers with technology tools to help maximize their returns. So should be a pretty fun topic, I think, for everyone here tonight. Or this afternoon. So let's kick things off. Chris or Eli, whoever wants to start here, from your perspective, where do you feel like most landlords start losing money? Let's just dive right into it. And how can they start to avoid this?
Yeah, well, I can jump in first, I guess. Yeah, I feel like landlords lose money by not collecting rent. It seems awfully, simple. Why aren't they collecting rent? But all sorts of issues arise for whatever reason. A tenant might not be paying rent, and if the landlord's not on top of it, sometimes that slips, and it might, the first time it may only slip a couple of days, then maybe it slips a week, or you're not following up with that. You're not issuing the correct documentation and doing the right process, and next thing you know, you're a month behind or 2 months behind or worse. And so, I mean, that I guess for me is the obvious, first one where landlords are going to be losing money.
Yeah, I'd echo those sentiments, and also just to add that I think that can start right at the beginning, because if you have to set expectations with the people that are going to be your tenants about what you're going to provide to them and also what you're going to expect. So, from the very beginning, when you're screening tenants, you want to establish a relationship where you are You are clear about what is expected. Doesn't mean you can't be compassionate when you need to be, but you want people that are reliable. They know you're going to hold them to what they're responsible for, and that you then follow up on that. And I think that's kind of most of what Chris is talking about there is like you got to be on top of it, because if you're not, that'll inform how people treat you, how they, in all kinds of ways, including paying rent, which is lack of rent is the best way to not to start losing money. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I often think about this in the combination of communication as well as process, right? Like as you said, you have to make sure you're communicating with them, but also set the tone and put things in. So you both have been in this for a while. How has that process changed for you? Maybe some mistakes you made earlier on where it's like, okay, you didn't pay rent and maybe not do things. Has that changed a lot over your tenure?
For
A
me, it
lot for
has quite a bit. Yeah, sorry,
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I'll jump in. Sure. Yeah. I mean, for
Yep.
me, it has quite a bit. Like, and what Eli brought up before, that starts from the very beginning. If you're not setting the right expectations and if you're not following the right process, you do set yourself up down the road for mistakes to happen. And so for me, like what has changed a lot is having rental criteria, just setting that out right off the bat. And had I known that in person, I'm the type of guy where, if I meet somebody, they come look at the vacancy and, they talk great, they've got good stories to tell and, they're moving because they missed rent somewhere else, but this is the reason why. And, I often I have compassion and I often actually then, take them at their word. And I think as I've made those mistakes early on when things didn't work out the way that they said it was going to work out, that for me, being able to have criteria and being able to say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. Step one, I'm doing this. This is what I'm looking at. Step two, I'm looking at this. Step three, I'm looking at this. And then when they come in and tell me that they've got a reason why this isn't good or why their credit score is not good or whatever, it's
Mm.
easier for me just to step back and say, I'm sorry to hear that, but you don't meet my criteria, and these are the things that I follow, and this is what I hold myself to, and this is in fact what in some places, like in the city of Seattle, where we have to have this criteria, and we're not allowed to, kind of deviate from that. I can say, well, I can't, my hands are tied, kind of, and it sort of protects me that I don't make bad decisions myself, that I can just kind of sort of take the emotion out of it.
And what Chris is talking about there with a rental criteria checklist is something that I was looking over ours. We have one on Landlord Gurus that you can download, and that's kind of a checklist for how the landlord goes about screening potential tenants. So, you want to look at income and references and just kind of basic, are pets or smoking allowed and those types of things. So, that's what we have as a download, as a checklist for you to develop a process for yourself. But it can also be developed and should be developed into a set of criteria by which you inform your potential tenants of what they need to meet to be accepted, and also, as Chris is pointing out, that you then follow routinely, and pretty strictly, so that you have a method to your madness that you're sticking to. So, and yeah, Grant, to answer your question, it's changed a lot for me. And I've been lucky over the years, and I've gone from not requiring any screening reports. Our first rental, I was working on the place, and my wife was out in front, and a nice couple walked by, and they asked about the property. They ended up being, fabulous tenants. Their credit was terrible for reasons that were understandable. And unfortunately, I might not rent to them today because I have a process that protects me more. But what what has changed is I now have a process. I have a criteria checklist. I require references that I follow up on, I follow through, and I check on, I contact, and also screening reports. So it's gone from very loosey-goosey to much more rigorous. That is the short answer to that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of my parents had rental properties, and so I remember growing up and going to deal with cleaning out tenants and that, and thinking back around what they were able to get away with to now, like as I said before we called, like I had recently moved to California. Like there's just every state you're going into, there's just different regulations and different challenges as we were talking about before we jumped on this. And it's
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that you have to think about as evolving, but what I like with the two of you, it's all about the community, right? So when I think about what you had said as far as putting together those checklists, I know you talk to each other quite a bit, but the housing community is one of those spaces where you can ask someone has done it before and someone is dealing with it right now. And so you kind of have to dig deep to find the information. And most of the time people are willing to share because there is a huge risk to renting any property. It doesn't really matter if you're making a lot of money or if you're not making any money, there's risk associated with all of it. And so it's good to have these things in place. Let's maybe jump over now to talk about where it all starts. So when you're listing a property, we talk about setting the tone. So how do you actually go through about making a listing stand out, kind of trying to scare off individuals that you don't like? What tricks have you both developed in that space?
I think,
Oh,
well, we talked about this a lot. Eli and I do is pre-screening. And I don't know if Eli was going to jump in and say the same thing,
no,
but
you go.
from,
I'm gonna let you take the lead, Chris. You're the yeah.
um, yeah, well, there's a lot to with listing and where to list and Eli and I definitely have opinions on where we should list and how to go about doing that. I'll just what I was going to say right off the bat was pre-screening.
Mhm.
So with that, I think with listing on Zillow and other platforms right now, it's very easy for potential applicants to just go through and say, I want to apply. Or, without even seeing it, without talking to you, they just say, I want to apply. There's a button there that's like, I want to apply. Or even if they've got a screening report that they've already done for somebody else, they can, oftentimes use that. But I think before we even get to that point with that applicant, I want to pre-screen. And that means, asking a series of just fairly basic questions up front that they can, you know, understand that they need to meet a certain, basic level, whether that's, income or credit score or, smoking or non-smoking or pets or no pets. Just things like that, you'd be surprised at how many times people just want to go see that apartment and, they're not going to be able to qualify right off the bat, but they want to go out and look at it. You got to go out and show it. And, then when they apply and you realize they don't meet the criteria, we've just wasted everybody's time. So for me,
Yeah.
that's kind of one of the things, you talk about. I don't want to say scare off the wrong ones, but it's you're making sure that they are probably going to qualify even before we get too far down the road.
Yeah, and to the question of creating a listing, I I'm just by personality, but also what I found is effective as kind of a bullet pointed format to listings because I think people can consume it fairly quickly and easily, and they don't most of the time read, or they don't remember, they don't read very thoroughly. They don't, or they don't remember. But your best bet at getting a good listing out there is something that's concise, not pages and pages of text, but that. And in fact, I break my listings down into a little bit of a description, which is kind of the header should get as much of the information that's really kind of attractive as you can fit into it. Something about location, any standout feature like dishwashers or a patio or top floor, that type of thing. And then I'll lead with a kind of a description of this is a nice older but well kept up building, I make a point of pointing out that this is family run um, or owner operated. People tend to like that actually. I find I get really good response out of that because a lot of people unfortunately have had bad experiences with large property management companies. And again, getting in there, any of the information about laundry, parking, location, and what the location means. What is it close to? So I'll get a fairly brief intro section, and then I'll get into the amenities, and I'll restate certain things. Hardwood floors, dishwasher, in unit or in building laundry, on-site parking, and then I'll get down to the details, and that's the term, the amount of rent, the deposits, the date it's available. So make sure you get the appealing stuff out there. Put a warm fuzzy spin on it as much as you can, but get the details there so that they're easy to consume. And then, as Chris is saying, when you get an inquiry, that's where you loop back around to saying, okay, do you make enough rent? Do you make enough income? Do you have pets? Do you smoke? When can you move? Those are my four. Yeah, right. Those are my four pre-screening questions. And the real benefit of that, in my mind, is that it weeds the field, because a lot of people won't fit those, won't answer those four questions in a way that is suitable for my rental. They won't want to move at the right time, or make enough money, or they have pets and I don't allow them, or and I'm so that weeds things down. And one of the benefits of that is that in a place like Seattle, we're required to take the first completed application. And take doesn't mean accept the applicant, but it means that we have to screen the application that we received first. It's got, first in time, and what Chris is talking about with like Zillow or some of these other sites where you can just have applications pouring in at you, is you can legitimately have to start screening, spending your time and their money on screening reports, with people that just aren't qualified on the basics. So I think Chris does as well. Chris, you turn off the allow applications from Zillow, don't you? I certainly do, because I
Right.
don't want
Yeah.
I don't want applications until I've been through this pre-screening process.
Right.
So
And I think going back to the listing, specifics, what Eli said was that, that's correct. Everything, I do the exact same thing. We also want to talk about photos, right? Take photos, take good photos. In some cases, depending on your property, you may even want to invest in professional photos. Maybe you only have to do that once, but you can reuse those photos, every time you've got a vacancy there. Just to, get really to show, your property in the true light, so to speak. Like, this is exactly actually what it is. Because you don't want people, and this is the same thing like with your description and your listing, I would say yes, highlight everything and put a warm fuzzy thing on things, but also be honest. Because what you don't want is somebody coming in expecting one thing, and having them come and say, oh, this isn't quite what I was expecting, or it looked in the pictures or in the description like I was going to get something else. And so again, you're wasting their time, you're wasting our time. So be honest, get good photos. I haven't done this, but I think Eli has, is uploading video of the property. You can get that 3D Matterport stuff as well. But yeah, I would say just try and show off your property, make it look good, but also make it look real.
Yeah, I've always
yeah.
found that when at all possible, putting floor plans in. I'm a huge floor plan guy, and like I think getting understanding for people, they're not always available, and depends on your investment and of course in the price point of them. But it's like a wonderful ad. So then people are looking, it's like, oh, will this work for my family, or does this work with my specific situation? Found it can also help with
And
that.
there's software that help you make those floor plans these days. I've
Yeah.
not yet found one that I found was easy enough. So if anybody
Right.
knows knows it, but I've tried it, and yeah, actually it's through Zillow. I think Zillow
Okay.
has one, but I've never followed it through. I've never not become frustrated and left the process. So
Cubic Casa, that's what somebody had written in one
Yeah.
of the. So
I haven't
yeah,
heard of
keep that in
Cubicasa,
mind. I
but
haven't either,
yeah,
but we'll have to check it
interesting.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
The other thing like, we find with FrontLobby, of course, for those of you who don't know, FrontLobby, you can report on-time payments as well as debts for rent to the credit bureaus. So
yeah,
Chris and Eli are talking about like what do you do before somebody even reaches out, right? And so if you put within that listing that you're going to report rental data to the credit bureaus, it tends to also have a bit of that screening effect. So someone that's maybe coming from a spot where they're not paying rent or they've had that in the past, maybe they're having to stretch to cover the rent there, so maybe they'll cut it, but life changes, and they have a propensity to not pay rent, they're just going to move on, right? Not paying the rent immediately has a negative impact on their credit score, whereas other individuals are going to be excited about that. Okay, cool. I can use my largest expense to help build rent. Kind of a few things like that that you can throw into it to help quickly segment individuals out so you can be mostly efficient with your time. And, you know, Chris, you're talking about going to the property, saving your time. Like you both manage your own portfolio, which means you're driving, you're spending the hours and the time, as a lot of the people that join these webinars are in the same boat. And so if you think, okay, what's the cost of driving, spending, I don't know, 90 minutes to go and actually do this person, pick up the phone. It's the easiest thing to do. And, if someone's not willing to answer a couple questions on the phone, the likelihood of them being a great tenant, a lot lower.
no, that's a
Yeah.
good, that's a great idea, and I didn't throw that in there, but you get the dual benefit, I think, of kind of dissuading people who are likely to run afoul of of the rent reporting and
Yeah.
getting the people who see it as an opportunity to build their credit.
Yeah.
So I absolutely concur that there's a lot to be gained there for everybody, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we were kind of leaching into this part here around screening now. So we've got the listing up. We've talked about kind of doing initial phone screens. You're going through. I know each state has different criteria around who can pay for screening and those sorts of things. So considering we're dealing with a national audience, we'll avoid some of the specifics based on your state. But what I'd say is always look at your local jurisdictions as far as how much you can charge for application fees, if you can charge the tenant or you're responsible to cover those. Eli highlighted which applicant you need to actually screen first. So we can't know all those specifics, but I definitely recommend you look at the local legislation to determine some of those sorts of things. But what do you do? What do you two do once you get that application in? What kind of technologies or process beyond just looking at a credit report are you doing to determine whether you want to rent to this individual?
Yeah, okay. So I do use a third-party screening service, and the one I use is tied in with the property management software that I use. And that going back to a previous question about things that we, have things that we have changed in our processes over the years. For me, using property management software is a big one as well. And so I use one, and it's got screening software built into that. So when I get, after a showing and I get somebody who's interested in applying, I collect their name and email and phone number, and then I put them into the software, the screening software, and it shoots them a link, and they fill it out. They what's best for me that I've seen is that applicant then pays that screening fee directly to the screening company. So I'm no longer collecting fees to run screening reports, which I used to do before, and then sometimes I'd collect from multiple people, and I'd only get to the first one, and they qualified, and then I would have to refund somehow that screening fee for the second one who I never actually screened. So when in this case, they pay the screening fees directly to that company, and within minutes, once they've completed it, I see a completed application and I see a completed credit report. So those are the first things that I look at. What I'm also looking at, and this comes in the application, is it asks for, it gives them the ability to upload documentation like pay stubs. I often require in the previous 2 months of pay stubs at least. It asks for their current landlord and previous landlord with their contact info so I can check references. It asks for their, employer contact so I can check their employer reference as well. So those are sort of the main things that, and it makes them upload their ID so that we are sure that we are looking at the person who is actually, says that they are. So those are kind of the big things. I don't know, Eli, do you look at anything else?
Well, even before the application comes in, I think just a red flag is when people don't don't follow through. You'll ask a question and they don't actually respond to the question that you asked. And this fits into that pre-screening period. So again, with kind of setting up expectations for like, you're going to be I'm going to expect you to provide information when I ask for it, and yeah, it all goes into kind of setting the stage for finding people and informing the people that you do move into your properties that they're going to need to meet expectations, and that goes down to a little kind of even just communication style and art, and it will show up in the application too a lot of the time. Like they'll provide one rental reference, but not the second or the third slot for a rental reference. So part of my criteria checklist is I want to see you know rental references for at least two of the last 4 years, because I understand somebody may have been traveling, or people are doing all kinds of things these days. So I try to set my criteria so that it's reasonable, but it's also thorough. I want to, and if I don't have if they can't provide rental references for the minimum that I'm expecting, then I make some allowances for employer references, but I set the expectation that I want to be able to meet, or to contact two references. And it just gives me some avenues to where people have to follow through. They have to work a little bit to get there. And if they're not doing that, if they're not just kind of putting the extra effort in, that's a red flag. And by holding them to account, I think it helps head off problems that could come up farther down the road. So.
Yeah. I mean, one of the trends we've seen a lot, and it's just increasing more and more every year, is fraud from the standpoint of documents, fake credit checks. So, Chris, I'm
Yeah.
glad you highlighted, make sure you're using the software that provides it directly to you. So the individual isn't handing you a sheet of paper and saying, I pulled this from Credit Karma. It's no,
Yeah.
make sure it's going to you. Same thing with IDs, right? Making sure you actually can verify the ID and the pay stubs are looking accurate if you're looking at those sorts of things. And there's softwares that can help you with that if you feel like you need some additional validation. But Eli, one of the questions that came through, and I get it a lot, is how are you verifying that when you are actually calling a reference that you're not speaking to my buddy Steve versus, my old landlord whose name is also Steve?
Yeah, that's a good one. I will sometimes Google people, and employer references. I feel like are a good resource there in terms of just checking in about whether or not the information that I'm being provided is accurate. Because all if I'm calling a company, then I often have at least an inkling, bit by an email address or how the phone is answered, that this is who I'm talking to. But I also think that you can tell sometimes by leaving the question in the references. The ball is with them. They have to, is this information accurate? Or open, or even open-ended questions. So could you tell me how much they paid in rent? So, and then they've got to try to figure out how to make sure that the stories are straight. And if it's just their friend Steve, things are probably going to fall apart. If you're asking too many questions, they're not gonna follow through very well, I think. But it's tricky. That's not an easy question, I don't think.
No.
I think
Well, I
it's
think with some of the, if their previous residence was at a, larger apartment complex, that's managed by, a professional property manager, or management company, you can often find the phone number for that office, rather than maybe the number that they give you, or, you can check and make sure that those numbers are the same so that when you do call, you can get to the main, receptionist or whoever's answering the phone, and you can then confirm that, ask for that property manager, that landlord, so that you're not like bypassing, using, somebody's cell phone that you're maybe going through the main office. You can do it that way. I think if it's also with a, private landlord, an independent landlord, and maybe it's a home or a small rental property, you can always look at the county records as well and make sure, see if the name that they've given you as the landlord is the same as the owner of that property. That might be something that you can look into.
contact multiple references.
Yeah.
That goes a long way.
And it may not be 100% foolproof, but I think, you can hopefully see, if it's totally egregious or not, or if they've given you an address that doesn't even exist when you look up the county records, you can do it that way as well.
Yeah. I see a couple questions coming through around fake IDs and fake pay stubs. Like, I find the first place to start with a bunch of that stuff is actually just, you can find easily on each state's website what an ID should look like. Gives you all the basic information, and kind of, some are pretty obvious. I've dealt with this for the past 6 years, so when you're looking at them, you can see. So some are pretty obvious, and then there is more and more softwares coming out. So depending on how you're using some of the AI tools, going through, I know you can actually go through and screen pay stubs or IDs or things to try and understand if it is fraudulent. So if you're kind of getting to that level of scrutiny, I would definitely, I'd say two things. One, the technology is there. Use it. We've talked about, adding that to our process. But two, the more landlords that we deal with, like, guts is something you need to kind of feel like. So if there's a couple things that are standing about this Grant character that's applying, and it doesn't quite fit your criteria, we've heard from a lot of people, kind of just listen to that gut and go from there. There's another. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think what Eli brought up, briefly before, in terms of having that applicant jump through a lot of different hoops.
Yeah.
That really does kind of, whittle down that, anybody who's looking to scam you, or if they are illegitimate, they're probably not going to go through all those different hoops. And sometimes that just happens by accident. I just had this applicant for a property that I just rented out that, I couldn't get hold of their landlords. And it, and this, also goes back to, I don't know why other landlords aren't responding to my requests for references, because I think it only helps everybody out. But anyway, I just could not get a response from both their previous two landlords. And, in my head, it's, like, I don't, does that, what does that mean? Does that mean that this applicant was not a good tenant, or is it just that these landlords are not, maybe they're no longer landlords anymore, or whatever it is? But the process was dragging on for quite a long time. And eventually I had this applicant get a cosigner, because I was like, if I can't get references from you, you don't qualify. I need to, I need you to basically prove or do more to show that, that you are who you are, and that you will be a good tenant. So, I got more bank information, I saw, like, more pay stubs, all this stuff. And eventually it was like, let's just have your parents co-sign. And to me, that then at that point, I was like, okay, if they're willing to go through all these steps, then, I think I'm willing to take that chance with them. And then at the end of the day, when their landlords finally contact me back, but it was fine.
Probably after they'd moved in, right? Like,
okay. After the cosigner came on and I did their screening and everything else, and then I heard from the other landlord. But
yeah, that's a really good reminder. Often people get stuck when they ask for something. They feel like that first ask is all they could do. Whereas, you don't have to stop there. If you need additional documentation, or if you need to, eventually need a cosigner or things, like, you can go back and ask them for additional things. And, those are additional hoops, and just You want to make sure that you're protected and secure.
Yeah, and if
Um,
they're not willing to do that, like Eli said, maybe
yeah,
they're not the right person for the place.
yeah. At what point in time, this was a question that came through, do you start to think about dropping the price? So if you've listed something, maybe the market's kind of evolving or changing, maybe a bad time of year. When do you start to think, okay, I'm priced wrong, I need to make some adjustments?
I'll take that one. Uh, I I think a lot about the time of year, and this just comes from having done this for quite a while in the markets that I'm doing it in. And I just know for some reason, at least my properties in April, they just sit there. And so I I think twice. I wait a little bit longer than I used to about before dropping the price, because when it comes down to it, in the past I've dropped the price and then still had it sit. So I'll think about history, and then I'll go and just do my own survey of Zillow and apartments.com and Craigslist, and see what else is out there. And I'm never totally maxing out what the rent. I'm never trying to get the every last dollar. I want you know in the range, in market pricing, even high in market rates, but not, I'm not never pushing it to the very top. And so as long as I'm relatively confident, I'll sit for 2 weeks or a month. If it sits for a month, I'll start dropping the price. But I'll check myself along the way to make sure that it doesn't seem like I've made a mistake somewhere. But if it doesn't seem like I have, I'll sit for a while. I'll sit for at least a month, in a lot of cases before changing it.
And you do have to consider, and calculate, for yourself, if I don't get it rented out, for X amount of time and I'm getting, this much in lost rent versus a reduction in price. I mean, that's a calculation you have to think about, but and at the same time, like in a place like where we are in Seattle, if you drop that price, well, you might not be able to raise that rent after you get them in for a year. And then if you do, you can only raise it by a certain amount if you're in a place that has, kind of rent increase rules. So yeah, all those are considerations I think that you have to take into, before you decide to drop rent. But yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah. Well, let's move on here to, I guess we've gone through there, the screening. So now you have someone that's in your property, and despite best efforts, they don't pay. So if a tenant stops paying, what are you doing as far as the next steps, recommendations that you take to try and make sure that you can get things back on track?
So there's a difference in my mind in terms of somebody who stops paying and somebody who comes to me and says, I'm having a problem. And I think what we're mostly talking about here is if somebody just stops paying their rent. But I just wanted to insert there that uh, on a couple of occasions, I've had people say, "Oh, hey, something's come up, and I'm having problem. My cash flow is going to be disrupted, and so I'm not going to be able to make rent on time this coming month, but I should be able to catch up over the next couple of months." And I'll work with them there, because that's an entirely different scenario than somebody who just stops doing what they've committed to doing. Or another scenario that's happened at least once is that if somebody's gets income at a specific time in the month, I'll sometimes adjust when it's due for them. As long as they're paying, it's I'm happy to meet them where they are. And I think that by having that attitude, you can keep people paying who might kind of out of desperation or needs stop paying. So I do think that it's worthwhile to work with people. If a tenant stops paying, as Chris said, but right off the bat, you have to be proactive. So as soon as a rent is legally late, which different places have different grace periods. So here, I think there's a 3-day grace period. As soon as it's legally late, then um, you need to follow up. And I wish it wasn't the case, but at this point in time, and with all of the changes to the rules about landlord tenant laws, in places like Seattle, where there are a lot of rules that have kind of shifted in a tenant's favor, you have to start giving official notices which are actionable. So that's a pay or vacate notice right off the bat. What I used to say was right when I first brought a tenant in was, hey, I'm pretty strict about paying rent. If you screw up once, that's one thing, and we'll talk about it. I won't be foregoing the late fee beyond that. So you could still do that, but at this point, the first step is to get an official notice that will be useful in an eviction proceeding going forward. And if as we all should, we're reporting rent through FrontLobby or otherwise to the credit bureaus, then informing them that you're going to be doing that is also in line, and it just keeps people with the expectation that they need to do what they committed to doing, and that yes, you will be holding them to it. So,
Yeah, I think enforcing late fees is a big one as well.
yeah.
And like Eli said, whatever cutoff date that is, that automatically just gets sent out to them that there's now a late fee. And that's kind of one of the beauties of some of these property management or rent collection systems as well, is that you can just automate that so that if it's 5 days late, on day 5, that late fee gets charged just right off the bat. And and you can always pull that back if you needed to, if that tenant comes to you, and says like, I'm having a hard time, or, like Eli said, if you're willing to work with them, you can always pull that late fee back. But I think it's good to have there just to make sure that it does get enforced. So there's, ways that just kind of set that expectation out there up front, and then it does, it's consistent. The consistency and the communication, I think, are the best ways to do that as well. As soon as they miss it, you're contacting them, you're communicating with them, and seeing if they've got, a legitimate reason that you're willing to work with them on, or if, they ghost you, and, and like Eli said, it's time to get those official steps in place, the notices that need to go out depending on where you are.
Yeah. I mean, most landlords that I speak with, and myself included, you're reasonable, right? So if someone's
Yeah.
communicating with you and they say they're gonna, get paid on the 7th, you still go through due process. But if you don't get paid on the 7th, it's a different conversation. Whereas you kind of want to make sure, because it's harder and getting harder in a lot of states to actually start to evict people, right? So doing those due processes. Now, there are some questions about software, and we'll just use FrontLobby as an example. There's nice ways that you can give notice before you actually get the official notices that you're talking about, as far as pay or quit, or there different things in different states, different terms. But software, for example, FrontLobby, you can do automated rent reminders, which go out a couple days. Other landlords, I know they like texting individuals or WhatsApp, whatever that is, but you can just automate that through FrontLobby. Then if someone doesn't pay on the 1st, you can log in, update that there's a debt, and then they'd get a late payment notice through the software, which would happen before you actually would serve them with the formal notice. And what we find is the first time this happens, it's probably best to text them or call them and say, hey, this is the process. You're late. I know that. Like, try and understand what it is. And don't just hide behind the automated communications or hide behind the notices. It's a conversation. These are people. Ideally, you want to make sure you're getting paid and that you're going through due process. And to highlight the importance of something like rent reporting is, like, you'll hear through this conversation and a bunch of other ones, it can take a long time to get someone out. There's a lot of paperwork. You have to make sure you're doing things appropriately. You can report someone's rent whether they have consent or not. Like, we provide clauses that you can put in your leases, clauses that you can put in the applications. those are really designed to help you screen, and they also allow that individual to use their on-time payments to build their credit. However, if there's ever a debt, like you can start reporting that month or the next month when it actually gets reported to the credit bureaus. And that allows you to actually put some pressure on that individual while you're following the jurisdictions, going through the appropriate court processes, trying to recover it. And so where I see that a lot of landlords get held up is if they give too much grace, they don't actually go through process, or they only go one pathway, meaning they think, oh, rent reporting is going to solve all my problems. Well, no, you need to go the legal side as well. Or they just go the legal side and don't take advantage of things like FrontLobby, where you could report that debt and on-time payments to the credit bureaus just to give themselves the best possible situation where you can maximize the likelihood of getting paid consistently.
Yeah, and
Also,
along those same lines, I think, we've talked about this before, Grant, when you're communicating with them and telling them that, hey, we're going to report this to the credit bureaus, but we're also going to report your on-time payments to the credit bureaus. And here's why this can, why it helps you. And I don't know that, I'm sure they understand it, but it might, you just get that reinforcement in there that by reporting the good payments, that this is going to set them up well for the future. And it's sort of I think we talked about as being a win-win, that it works for everybody. And then I think if everybody understands that up front, I think that goes a long ways.
yeah, I'd never remove the personal element of it, as I think you were alluding to, Grant. It's a personal message, an individual to individual message should always be first, and even if it does go with an official notice or an action, then I do think that it's worth maintaining, the soft touch to some extent, and because you can sour relationships that don't otherwise need to be soured if you don't take that little bit of extra effort to say, hey, I noticed that rent's not is I don't see your rent. Can you tell me what's going on here? And maybe they get a day before you send beyond that, before you send the notice. And the notices are consequential and important here, especially in a place like Seattle where we have effectively kind of we have what's called just clause evictions, and essentially what it means is that you have a tenancy, you have to continue to extend offers for tenancy as long as somebody wants to accept them. So there's no such thing really as a fixed term tenancy anymore. And within that, one of your only ways of kind of moving on from a tenant who's problematic is to have a number of notices over the course of a period of time. I think it's 4 over a year. That's adequate. If you've had 4 late payments or 4, disturbance or a combination of such, then that could be enough to compel them to move on. But you have to be giving those out in a relatively timeful manner, in order for them to be effective and useful. So it's a real balancing act.
Yeah. Very specific question here that came through. When there's a late fee initiated and there's a 3-day grace period, are you charging the fee on day 3 or day 4?
4.
Okay.
Just because I would read that as the 3 days were the grace.
Yeah.
So the fourth is and so that in the spirit of grace.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the same. It usually, most of the laws that I've read on it, it'll give you a specific example. So like, oh, you can issue it on the 4th or something. But yes, I interpret it the same way.
Yeah.
I'm also seeing a few questions around reporting delinquencies, things in New York and stuff as well. So let me just clarify that. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but across the US, if someone doesn't pay their rent, you can report that as a debt within FrontLobby. and that debt can get reported to the credit bureaus. It will show up on their credit file the following month. So the previous month's rental data gets reported in the middle of the month, which means that at the end of August, you'll have that rental data that gets reported to the credit bureaus for the month of August. And you don't need consent or judgment to report unpaid rent and utilities that are outlined within the lease. So you can do this while the individual is living in the property. We're not going to focus too much on it today, but there's different avenues when someone moves out of a property. I've seen some questions come through around that. FrontLobby, you can report unpaid debt from former tenants up to the past 7 years. You don't need current addresses. You don't need contact information. If you're looking to grab contact information, like I would look for a collection agency within your local area, meaning usually within your state, that has had some success around housing and would deal with a small independent landlord. Other ways to do that is to contact a paralegal or a lawyer. Sometimes they can help with wage garnishment or looking for skip tracing, some of those services as well. So a paralegal is a really good resource to reach out to there as well, because they can help you get that contact information and help you navigate those. So I just highlight those because I've seen some questions, but those are more specific once the individual moves out. Whereas what we've highlighted is kind of what you can do to either make sure that person can stay in your property and continue to pay, which is great, or make sure that you're actually able to get them out as fast as possible so you can turn over that property and get someone else in it. Before we jump over to the last kind of couple questions as we're going through, I want to give you both the opportunity to share kind of a closing thought or an actual item that you feel like would serve the purpose of people that are on the call. If you don't have one specific, that's okay too. But just wanted, before we dive into specifics, if there's any closing thoughts you wanted to leave people with.
Yeah, for me, we've alluded to it, and that is to have a process that you follow, and an element of that is a set of criteria by which you select tenants. So and Chris and I have learned this through trial and error, but where we list is, we've kind of established that we're going to list all over the board, including Zillow, which we don't use for everything else, but we do use for listing because it gets so many eyeballs. But the process is list, and then weed things out, weed people out by through the pre-screening process, and then send them to your application. I require that people see occasionally virtually, through a video tour, but I require that people actually see the property. I like to meet them in person almost to a fault. Occasionally, I'll do it over video. And then have your rental criteria, but they have to meet and follow that, and treat everybody the same. Treat every inquiry in order that it comes in. We're required to do that, but it's also just fair. And it establishes something that's repeatable, that defendable, and where people kind of understand who you are and what you expect of them. So just have a process and follow it.
Yeah, I was going to say kind of exactly what's on the slide right there is landlording is a business. And treat it like that. And that means a lot of different things, but it can mean making sure that you're set up properly and you got your right processes, like what Eli was saying, so you're not deviating, you're not making things up as you go. Like businesses don't do that. Follow your processes, follow your rules. It doesn't mean you can't have compassion or you can't have empathy for the tenants or for your customers, right? Like any business would in certain aspects, but it just means making sure that you are doing right. That this is not just a hobby for you. That this is actually something that you are expecting to gain from, and treat it that way. You're not doing this for free. So you got to value your time, value your efforts, and that goes a long ways. And that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, whether that's hiring out maintenance stuff, or so that you're not wasting your own time doing it, or maybe that means doing it yourself. I don't know, but that's for each individual landlord to determine. But if you think of it as a business, I think that sort of informs um, you know, how you run the thing and how you run your properties and how you manage your time.
I think with all the businesses I've been involved with, landlording is one of the hardest ones to always remember that, right? There's a personal component to someone you're talking about someone's house, you're providing housing. And I find especially new landlords, they get sucked into that emotional side, which is it's okay to acknowledge it. It's going to exist, right? And so knowing that that's going to exist there when you're dealing with someone's house or someone can't pay rent and there's emotion around it, or you reject them as an applicant. And yet going back to your point, Chris, it is, a business that you have to operate. And by treating it as a business, you are protecting your family, right? Which is, whether that's just you or you actually have a family, that is your responsibility. And the tip that I'd add to that I've seen more and more as the time goes on is leverage the community. Whether you're just getting into it as an individual or whether you've been in it a long time, if you've been in it a while, you know that there's a pretty strong community. There's about 50%, just under 50% of the housing in the US is provided by small independent landlords. And so these individuals have had to cut their teeth, lean on each other. They've made mistakes. And so whether that's Facebook groups, relying on someone like Landlord Gurus with courses, if you want that additional details, whether you're going to kind of some meetups or masterminds, whatever that is, get the information because it's out there, sometimes free, sometimes paid. It just depends on what you're looking for. So, I've always found that to be a pretty good advice when people are trying to get into this.
And that's how Eli and I started Landlord Gurus to begin with, is that we were each, managing our properties and we were having questions and, running into things, and we would just talk to each other and ask each other questions. And this is sort of how it turned out. We decided to put it all out there for others like us, because there are a lot of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you guys want to talk about Section 8 housing quickly? Are you familiar with Section 8 housing? I've got a question here dealing with Section 8 application, and they want a guarantor of a third of the rent that the tenant is responsible for. Any thoughts on how a landlord can protect itself when you're dealing with Section 8?
I'll have to be honest, Grant. It's been a long time since I've dealt with Section 8, and for our purposes in Seattle, we're required to treat, and so you want to check in your own location. We're required to treat that income, and in fact, in some places, even unemployment income, as equal with the same as any other type of income. So I would caution. The only thing I would say is if I were faced with that, I would be cautious about asking more of somebody that who had a Section 8 income than I would otherwise.
Yeah. Awesome. Another question is, what if your gut tells you something's off about an applicant, but you've done all the research and it pans out? Is there a way that you can deny them without breaking the law?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I think that you'd like to be able to trust your gut, but you do have to be very careful that that gut is not leading you to do something illegal or violating discrimination rules. And that's tough. I mean, I think that comes with setting your criteria up front and being kind of fair and consistent with that to everybody, and so that that your criteria are will lead you to that right tenant. I know that's sort of it's kind of touchy feely and stuff, but it's easier to just follow. I think to just follow that criteria, and if that criteria leads you down that path, that's going to be the right. If your criteria is good, then hopefully you're making the right decision.
Well, it totally depends on where you are.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, not every location are your landlords required to take the first applicant. So, you have to know your local laws, which is an increasingly difficult task these days. And, Chris and I are both members of our local RHA for that purpose in particular, because they keep up on it. and we can get the information that we need, and keep current by being part of the RHA. But I think that being said, I think Chris is right that if you have a good criteria, a set of criteria, if you have a good process, and a lot of it is just like if somebody has to jump through all of these different hoops, and they have to answer the questions, and they have to provide the references, and they have to provide the screening reports, and it would be very difficult to make it through my process. I'm going to knock on wood right now, but it would be very difficult to make it through and be a true train wreck, because it's just kind of it takes some effort, and it's designed in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to close on that question because I think it highlights a lot of what we've talked about. And the thing to remember is I always think like if something's off with your gut, get more data. Like dive deeper, ask for another reference or whatever. Like you can kind of continue to go suss that out, but make sure you obey the law. And it's just getting more and more important these days. So as you said, very, very different in each state. So as we close out here, I just want to highlight a couple things. So for those of you that are still with us, appreciate you spending the full hour listening to us. Those of you that dropped off, you're going to get the full recording, as well as you're going to get a couple things in your inbox tomorrow. So first, we have a rent ready checklist that's coming out from FrontLobby. You can also, I forget if there's specific links, but on our website, we also have free clauses that you can put in. So we talked about adding clauses to your applications as well as to your leases to help with screening. Again, consent's never required when reporting debt, but when you're thinking about the process and how you're framing yourself when you're actually putting a property and talking with applicants, it's a really important thing you can look at. The other thing is Eli and Chris have put together an awesome screening checklist. So you'll also get this in your inbox tomorrow, and you can go through it, whether you're screening or kind of looking to adjust. I would encourage you to read through it. There's a lot of good information there. They've spent a lot of time putting it into it. So that'll be hitting your inbox as well. If you want to learn more about FrontLobby specifically, you can always reach out to us, support@frontlobby.com. You can book a time with an expert using the QR code on our website, or just go to frontlobby.com and check us out. So that is going to be hitting your inbox tomorrow as well for some contact details. And we've also, Eli and Chris have been very generous, and they're offering everyone that's listening to the webinar 50% off their courses. So do you want to just give kind of a quick explanation what those courses are, just to close out?
Yeah, we've got a handful of courses. One of them, the most comprehensive is our Landlording A to Z, and it's geared towards not just new landlords, but experienced landlords as well. And it just covers kind of the entire process of what it means to be a landlord and how you go about and all the different steps that you would take through the course of a tenancy, from stuff we talked about today: advertising, screening, rent collection, leases, all that. We've got kind of chapters and modules on each one, and so Landlording A to Z kind of is that comprehensive course that we've got up there.
Yeah.
And then there are a couple of individual modules there too. And then there's also an opportunity to do one-on-one consulting with us as well. We do a free upfront kind of quick conversation to ascertain whether or not it's a fit and whether or not we can provide any guidance for your particular situation. And if so, we'll send you a proposal about what we can do for you, and then we dig in deep with you and try and help you with whatever you're grappling with at the time. So
amazing. Well, thank you both for your time, sharing your insights. I always enjoy when we talk. I find I always learn a little bit and get to pull on some of your experiences. So thank you to both of you, and thanks to everyone to join. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Take care.